The cabin of the night flight glowed under soft yellow lights. Engines hummed steadily as most passengers drifted between sleep and boredom. In row 10, a thin man in a worn jacket slept lightly. An 8-year-old girl leaned against his chest, her fingers gripping his sleeve. From business class, a man turned around and said loudly, "Why is someone like that sitting so close to us?" People stared. A few smirked. A flight attendant knelt and whispered, careful but firm, "Sir, would you mind moving to the back?" The man opened his eyes. He didn't argue. He gently woke his daughter. She looked up and whispered, "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" As he stood, the captain's voice suddenly echoed through the cabin. "Tension, please. Is there a combat pilot on board?" The cabin froze. So did the man in row 10. His name was Ethan Ward. He was 36 years old, and for the past 5 years, he had been a single father. At this moment, none of that mattered to the people around him. To them, he was just a tired man in row 10, wearing a faded jacket that had seen better days. His shoes were scuffed. His hands were rough, the kind shaped by long hours of manual work. He worked wherever he could, mechanic jobs, delivery driving, short-term repairs. Nothing permanent, nothing impressive. The ticket he held was the cheapest one he could find. That was why he was on this flight. Ethan was taking his daughter Lily to visit her grandmother. It had been almost a year since they last went. Money had been tight. Time had been tighter. When he finally saw a discounted nighted flight, he didn't hesitate. He chose row 10 on purpose. Years ago, he had learned that seats near the wing felt more stable during turbulence. Less shaking, less sudden drops. Better for a child who struggled to sleep. That knowledge came from a past life he never spoke about, a life he had carefully locked away. By the time the plane took off, Lily had already fallen asleep. She always did when she felt safe. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter around her shoulders and adjusted his arm so her head rested more comfortably against his chest. Only then did he close his eyes. The day had been long, too long. He had worked 12 hours straight, fixing a truck engine that refused to cooperate. His back still ached. His hands smelled faintly of oil, no matter how hard he scrubbed them earlier. Exhaustion pulled him under faster than he expected, but he never truly slept. Ethan was the kind of man who rested lightly, always alert. Even with his eyes closed, he noticed the glances, the looks from people who passed row 10 on their way back from the restroom. The brief pauses, the subtle judgment. From business class, the stares were sharper. Well-dressed passengers reclined comfortably, drinks in hand, glancing toward economy with thinly veiled disdain. One man whispered to another, loud enough to carry, "Some people should know their place." Ethan heard it. Of course he did. He didn't react. Instead, he shifted slightly and adjusted Lily's position again, turning her face inward so she wouldn't hear. He pulled the collar of his jacket higher, covering her ear with the fabric. His priority was simple. Let her sleep. Let her feel safe. That was all that mattered. What no one noticed was the small, almost invisible motion of his fingers. As Lily's breathing slowed, Ethan tapped gently against his own leg. A soft, steady rhythm. 2 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. Then repeat. It wasn't random, it was a grounding rhythm, a method used to control breathing under stress, to stay calm when adrenaline surged, to keep the mind sharp in chaos. 2 rows ahead, in seat 2A, a woman glanced back. Her name was Aria Dalton. She was dressed elegantly, her posture relaxed, her expression composed. To the rest of the cabin, she looked like just another executive traveling business class. But she noticed things others didn't. Her eyes lingered on Ethan's hand, on the rhythm, on how his breathing matched it perfectly. For a brief moment, something stirred in her memory. A briefing room, a simulation, a voice explaining how combat pilots stabilize themselves before critical maneuvers. She frowned slightly. That's impossible, she thought. The man in row 10 was just a tired father. Nothing more. Aria turned back toward the front of the cabin and dismissed the thought. Behind her, Ethan stopped tapping as Lily slept peacefully, unaware that her father's past was beginning to surface, quietly, dangerously, at 35,000 feet. The first jolt came without warning. The aircraft shuddered hard, just once, then steadied. A few gasps rippled through the cabin. Overhead bins rattled faintly. The seatbelt sign chimed on, glowing amber above every row. Lily stirred in her sleep, her fingers tightening around Ethan's jacket. "It's okay," he whispered softly, not fully awake himself. "Just a little bump." For a moment, the plane seemed to calm. Conversations resumed. Screens flickered back to movies and maps. But the tension never fully left. Then came the second jolt. This time it was stronger. The plane dipped slightly, enough to make several passengers cry out. Drinks sloshed. Someone screamed from the back. A nervous laugh followed. Too loud, too forced. In business class, irritation quickly replaced fear. A man stood halfway up from his seat, gripping the headrest in front of him. His voice cut sharply through the cabin. "This is ridiculous. Why are we shaking like this?" Another passenger pointed toward the economy, straight at row 10. "And why is he still sitting there? He looks unstable. Dangerous." The word hung in the air. Dangerous. Heads turned, eyes locked onto Ethan. A woman shook her head openly. Someone else muttered, "Unbelievable." The judgment was no longer subtle. It was loud, public, cruel. Ethan opened his eyes fully now. He felt Lily tense against him. Her breathing changed. She was awake. The flight attendant returned, her expression tight, professional strain visible beneath the practiced smile. "Sir," she said quietly, "I'm going to need you to move, for everyone's comfort." Ethan looked up at her, then at the faces watching him. He nodded. "I understand," he said calmly. No anger, no defense. He carefully unbuckled his seatbelt, then Lily's. She clung to him, her arms wrapping around his neck. "I don't want to move," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I know," Ethan replied. "Just stay close to me." As he stood and stepped into the aisle, the whispers grew louder. "About time. Should have been in the back from the start." People like that always cause problems. Ethan kept his head down. He took one step forward. Then the plane lurched violently. This time there was no mistaking it. The nose dipped. The engines roared unevenly. The cabin filled with screams. Oxygen masks shook loose above several rows, dangling uselessly. The intercom crackled. Then the captain's voice came through again, no longer calm. "If there is any combat pilot on board, this is an emergency. Please respond immediately." The words slammed into the cabin. Silence followed. No one moved. Business class froze. Economy froze. Fear settled heavy and thick in the air. Ethan stopped walking. His posture changed. The exhaustion that had weighed him down moments earlier vanished. His shoulders straightened. His breathing slowed, deep and controlled. He looked down at Lily and crouched to her eye level. "Stay here," he said softly. "Close your eyes. Hold your seat." "But Daddy, I'll be right back." He pressed his forehead gently to hers, then stood and turned toward the front of the plane. A man stepped into the aisle, blocking him. The same man from business class. "Sit down," he snapped. "You're not a pilot. Don't make this worse." Ethan looked at him. His gaze was steady, cold, not angry, focused. "Move," Ethan said quietly. Something in his voice made the man hesitate. He stepped aside without realizing why. Ethan moved forward. Each step down the aisle was deliberate, balanced. His hands brushed seatbacks instinctively, steadying himself with practiced ease as the plane continued to shake. Aria Dalton stood up from seat 2A. Her heart pounded as she watched him approach. It wasn't just the way he walked. It was the timing, the awareness, the way he adjusted his steps to the plane's movement, the way he leaned slightly forward, as if already compensating for turbulence. This was not a civilian. This was not a mechanic. She had seen this posture before. Years ago, in places most people never knew existed. The cockpit door was already open, a flight attendant shouting urgently inside. Ethan reached the door just as the plane dipped again. He grabbed the frame with one hand, grounding himself instantly. Inside, chaos ruled. Warning alarms blared. Red lights flashed across the instrument panel. The co-pilot clutched his headset, panic clear in his eyes. The captain's left hand was bleeding, a shallow cut from hitting the console during turbulence. They both looked up. The captain stared at Ethan, disbelief washing over his face. "You were sleeping in row 10? Ton?" he asked. Ethan didn't respond to the disbelief. "Tell me what you lost," he said calmly. The simplicity of the question cut through the noise. The co-pilot blinked. "Autopilot disengaged. Sensors are giving conflicting data." Ethan nodded once. "I'll take the right seat," he said. He moved without waiting for permission. As he sat down, his hands settled naturally on the controls. Fingers curved, wrists aligned, posture perfect, military perfect. Outside the cockpit, Arya watched through the narrow opening. Her breath caught. There was no doubt left. The man who had been humiliated in row 10 was not who anyone thought he was. And the flight was now resting in his hands. Inside the cockpit, the noise was relentless. Warning alarms pulsed in sharp intervals. Red indicators flashed across the panels. The aircraft pitched slightly left, then corrected, then dipped again. Outside the windows, thick clouds swallowed the night. The captain steadied his injured hand and looked at Ethan again, searching his face for certainty. "What's your experience?" he asked quickly. Ethan didn't look away from the instruments. "Multiple airframes," he said. "Sit down. High-threat environments. Manual recovery under sensor failure." The co-pilot stared at him. Those weren't civilian words. Ethan scanned the displays with practiced speed. Airspeed, angle of attack, altitude fluctuations. Conflicting pitot data. His jaw tightened. "Angle of attack sensor is lying," Ethan said. "Pitot tubes are giving delayed pressure. Autopilot trusted bad data and kicked itself offline." The co-pilot shook his head. "We followed procedure, and procedure is killing you right now," Ethan cut in, calm but firm. He pointed to a system toggle most commercial pilots never touched, outside training manuals. "Disable that channel," Ethan said. "Now, Strom." The captain hesitated. "That's not standard." "Standard is gone," Ethan replied. "You want stable flight or you want permission?" The plane shuddered violently, answering the question for them. The captain nodded. "Do it." The co-pilot flipped the switch. Several alarms went silent at once. The sudden quiet felt unnatural. Ethan adjusted trim manually, his movements precise and controlled. The aircraft leveled slightly, still shaking, but no longer fighting itself. "Hold this pitch," Ethan said. "Don't chase the numbers. Fly the feel." The co-pilot swallowed and obeyed. Outside the cockpit, Arya Dalton stood frozen. She had pushed past a flight attendant without realizing it. Her eyes were locked on Ethan's hands, on how they rested on the controls, on how he didn't overcorrect, didn't rush. This wasn't talent. This was conditioning. Her gaze dropped to his wrist as he reached forward. The sleeve of his jacket pulled back slightly, revealing a faint scar running diagonally across his skin. Old, healed badly, the kind of scar that didn't come from an accident. It came from impact or ejection. Her heart skipped. "Shadow wing," she whispered under her breath. Ethan didn't look at her, but he didn't deny it either. The captain glanced between them. "You know him?" Arya stepped into the cockpit fully now, the hum of power surrounding her. "I know the unit," she said carefully. "Not the man." Ethan's eyes flicked to her for half a second, then back to the sky. "Focus on the plane," he said. Another wave of turbulence hit. The nose dipped again, sharper this time. The co-pilot gasped. Ethan reacted instantly, countering with manual input, stabilizing the roll before it could escalate. "Ride it," Ethan said. "Don't fight it. Let it pass." Seconds stretched. The plane shook, then steadied. The captain exhaled shakily. "We almost lost altitude control." "You did," Ethan said. "We got it back." Arya watched him closely now. "You didn't answer the captain's question," she said. "Why did you leave?" For the first time, Ethan paused. Not his hands, not the plane, just his voice. "My wife died," he said quietly. "Same year I left the unit." The cockpit fell silent except for the hum of engines. "She was a civilian," Ethan continued. "Killed in a crash, commercial flight, weather misjudgment, pilot error." Arya's chest tightened. I stayed airborne after that, Ethan said. Did my job, finished my missions. But every time I strapped in, I saw my daughter growing up without a father. He adjusted the trim again, steady. So I landed, he said, for good. The co-pilot didn't speak. Neither did the captain. Lily. That was the reason. Ethan kept his eyes forward. She's 8. She sleeps better when she can hear my heartbeat. Another pocket of turbulence slammed into them. This one was worse. The plane yawed violently. Altitude dropped faster. A new alarm screamed to life. Severe wind shear, the co-pilot said, panic rising. We're losing lift. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice unwavering. Kill the auto throttle rating, he said. I'll manage thrust. That's insane, the co-pilot said. We're not trained for that. I am, Ethan replied. The captain met Ethan's eyes. Do it, he ordered. The engines responded unevenly as Ethan took manual control. He compensated instantly, adjusting power asymmetrically to counter the crosswind. His movements were small, efficient, almost gentle. Cloud density will break in 12 seconds, Ethan said. When it does, we climb, not before. How do you know? Arya asked. Ethan didn't answer. He counted under his breath. 10, 9, 8. The turbulence eased slightly. Now, Ethan said. He increased thrust smoothly, lifting the nose just enough. The aircraft surged upward, breaking through the cloud layer into clear air. The shaking stopped. Alarms fell silent. For the first time in minutes, the plane flew straight. The co-pilot slumped back in his seat, breathing hard. The captain stared at the horizon, disbelief written across his face. You saved us, he said quietly. Ethan didn't respond. He loosened his grip on the controls slightly, but stayed alert. We'll divert, the captain said. Emergency landing near a suitable runway. Ethan nodded. I'll stay until approach is stable. Outside the cockpit, the cabin remained tense, unaware of how close they had come to disaster. Back in row 10, Lily sat alone, hugging her knees, eyes squeezed shut just like her father told her. She counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3. She didn't know why she trusted him so completely. She just did. Inside the cockpit, Arya looked at Ethan again, seeing him clearly now. Not as the tired man in row 10, but as someone who had once carried lives through the squall, then chosen to come down for love. And she realized something else. The humiliation he endured earlier wasn't an accident. It was the cost of walking away from the sky. And now, at 35,000 feet, the past had caught up with him. The descent began smoothly, almost gently, like the sky itself was finally letting them go. The captain coordinated with air traffic control, voice still tight but steady now. The co-pilot followed instructions with shaking hands, trying to regain the rhythm of normal procedure. Ethan stayed in the right seat, eyes forward, posture unchanged. He didn't celebrate. He didn't speak unless necessary. When the runway lights appeared through the dark, the cabin felt the difference immediately. The violent shaking was gone. The screaming had stopped. Passengers sat in stunned silence, listening to the engines, the flaps, the careful changes in pitch. Fear still lingered, but it was no longer a wild animal. It had been contained. The landing was firm, but safe. Tires hit the runway, a heavy thump, a long roll, then braking, steady and controlled. The aircraft slowed, turning off toward emergency vehicles waiting in a line of flashing lights. For a second, the plane was silent. Then the cabin erupted. People cried. People laughed. People clapped without even thinking. A stranger hugged another stranger. Someone whispered, "Thank God," again and again, like a prayer they couldn't stop saying. The captain's voice came over the speakers, calmer now but thick with emotion. "We have landed safely. This was an emergency diversion. Thank you for staying seated, and thank you to the passenger who stepped forward when we needed help." Applause swelled again, louder. Heads turned toward the front. Some people stood in the aisle, craning their necks, desperate to see the hero they had imagined. Many expected a uniform, a confident older man, someone polished, someone who belonged. They didn't expect Ethan. Ethan didn't wait for attention. The moment the cockpit door opened, he stepped out quickly and moved down the aisle, ignoring the hands reaching toward him, ignoring the voices calling out. "Sir, thank you. Are you military?" He didn't answer. He kept walking straight back to row 10. Lily was still there, small and rigid, clutching her own arms as if holding herself together. Her eyes were wide now. She wasn't crying. She looked like she had been brave for too long. Ethan dropped to his knees beside him. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm here." Lily threw her arms around his neck so hard it almost knocked him off balance. Her body shook, and only then did she start to cry. Ethan held her close, one hand cradling the back of her head. He whispered, "You did perfect. You listened. I'm proud of you." Lily pulled back just enough to look at him. "Daddy," she whispered, voice trembling, "are you a hero?" Ethan's expression softened. A small, tired smile touched his mouth. "No," he said. "I'm just your dad." Behind them, the cabin shifted. People who had mocked him earlier now stood frozen in shame. The business class man who had called him someone like that couldn't meet Ethan's eyes. His face was pale. His mouth opened once, then closed. Like the words wouldn't come out because he knew they would sound too small. A woman who had smirked earlier stepped closer, hands clasped. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm truly sorry." Others followed, small apologies, broken voices, eyes lowered, the kind of regret that arrives late but still burns. Then Aria Dalton appeared in the aisle. She moved with calm authority, but her face was different now. The composure remained, yet something deeper had surfaced in her eyes. Respect, humility, maybe even guilt. She stopped beside Ethan and Lily. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she lowered her head slightly, not as a gesture for the crowd, but as if she needed Ethan to know it was real. "You sat in row 10, she said softly. "But you carried the scape." Ethan looked up at her. His gaze was steady, but there was no pride in it. "I did what anyone should do," he said. Aria shook her head. "Not everyone can." The aisle behind her was filled with watching faces now. People who had been cruel. People who had been afraid. People who had survived because a quiet man in an old jacket stood up anyway. Ethan didn't look at them. He tightened his arms around his daughter and focused on her breathing, matching it to his own. Outside the windows, emergency lights flashed across the wet runway. Inside, the truth settled into the cabin like a weight. Honor had never belonged to the seat number. It belonged to the moment someone rose when everyone else stayed frozen. The aircraft sat still on the runway as emergency crews finished their checks. Slowly, the tension drained from the cabin. Passengers remained seated longer than necessary, as if standing too quickly might break something fragile. Ethan stayed in row 10. He didn't give interviews. He didn't answer questions. When a flight attendant approached and quietly asked for his name for the report, he gave it politely, then asked only one thing in return. "Please let my daughter get off first. She's tired." That was all. When they finally stepped onto the tarmac, cool night air brushed across their faces. Lily held his hand tightly, her fingers still wrapped around his like she might lose him if she let go. Later that night, in a quiet terminal room, the captain found Ethan again. He didn't bring a camera. He didn't bring an airline representative. He carried a folded piece of paper in his hand. "I wrote this myself," the captain said, "not the company." It was a handwritten letter. Simple, direct, grateful. It thanked Ethan for steady hands, for calm judgment, for saving lives without hesitation. Ethan read it once, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Thank you," he said. Aria Dalton waited until the captain left. She stood a few steps away, not imposing, not surrounded by assistants. Just a woman who had watched a man carry a sky full of strangers and then kneel to hold his child. She handed Ethan a card. "If you ever want to fly again," she said gently, "not for war, just for purpose, call me." Ethan looked at the card. He didn't take it right away. "I don't know if I belong up there anymore," he said, nodding slightly toward the dark sky beyond the glass. Aria didn't push. "Belonging changes," she said. "That doesn't mean it disappears." Ethan finally accepted the card, tucking it beside the letter. "I'll think about it," he said. That was the closest thing to a promise he could give. As they walked away together, Lily yawned and leaned against him. "Daddy," she said softly, "when I was scared, I listened to your heartbeat." Ethan smiled and kissed the top of her head. "I was listening to yours," he replied. They left the airport quietly, without applause, without headlines, without anyone following them. By morning, the story would travel without them, online, on screens, in words that would never quite capture the moment. But Ethan didn't need the story. He had what mattered. Some people carry medals, some carry titles, some carry scars they never explain, and some carry children home after the sky tries to take everything away. That night reminded everyone of something simple and easily forgotten. The quietest people often carry the heaviest pasts. True honor doesn't sit in first class. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask to be seen. It shows up when the moment arrives, and when it's over, it goes back to row 10. Never judge a person by where they sit, what they wear, or how quiet they are. Some people once carried responsibilities heavier than we can imagine. They flew higher than most. They faced danger so others wouldn't have to. Then one day they chose to land. Not because they were weak, but because someone needed them more on the ground. True strength doesn't shout. True honor doesn't demand respect. And real heroes don't need recognition. When the moment comes, they simply stand up. They act. They protect. And when it's over, they return to silence. Because the greatest title a person can ever hold is not pilot, soldier, or hero. It is father. If you believe real heroes don't ask for recognition, if you believe dignity lives in quiet choices, and if stories like this remind you of what truly matters, subscribe to this channel. Here we tell stories about honor, sacrifice, and fathers who choose love over glory.